all rechargeable batteries become less effective as they chemically age. Apple went on to say that iOS updates aim to manage older phones to prevent unexpected battery shutdowns. But that can also mean longer launch times for apps and other reductions in performance. As a result, Apple says it will soon issue an update that gives users more visibility into the health of their iPhone's battery so they can see for themselves if its condition is affecting performance. Let's bring in our guests then for today's discussion. From London, we're joined by Glyn Moody, who you saw in Natasha's report, a technology writer and blogger. He's the author of Rebel Code, Linux and the Open Source Revolution. From Xi'an in China, via Skype, Wang Boyan, a writer for TechNode, an English-language publication that covers China's tech industry. And from New York, we're joined by Dean Crutchfield, a branding expert. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Glyn, let's start with you then. Does Apple's explanation as to why they've throttled back performance on some iPhone models make technical sense? Does it stand up to scrutiny?
I think it does, and there's an important point to make here which hasn't been drawn out perhaps enough. People are talking about phones being slowed down, and Apple has said that it does do that, but only in certain circumstances. For example, when it's drawing excessive power from the battery. So this is not about slowing down phones all the time. It's about certain moments, as you rightly mentioned. When you launch an app, when you scroll through things, then you may see some slowing down. So it's not true that they are slowing down their phones in general. They are stopping the peak power causing problems.
So basically, Apple's introduced a performance slowdown to mask, at some times, some points when you're using the phone, you'll notice this slowdown to mask a deficiency in battery power. The computing power of the phone hasn't changed. It hasn't got any slower. I mean, what are the ethics of this?
Well, I mean, personally, I think, as I said in the excerpt that you showed before, that Apple has communicated this extraordinarily badly. They could have said and should have said, we are trying to help people use their phones for longer. We're actually extending their life. Instead, they made this change without telling people, and that was the big mistake, I think.
Wang Bayan in Xi'an, Apple has apologized for its poor handling of the issue. It's cut the price of a battery replacement. But if this throttling is software controlled, is a new battery going to restore performance to my iPhone?
Yes, just as you said, once the new battery is replaced onto the old devices, the performance will return to its normal standard. Yes.
Okay, this isn't then, as far as you're concerned, a case of programmed obsolescence, as some people have suggested. Indeed, France taking a serious look at that issue. Apple isn't deliberately slowing older phones in order to get us all to buy a new iPhone.
I think this is a battery problem. It's not a processor problem. So the problem is about the battery. Once the battery is on its chemical ends, so Apple, in order to extend its lifespan, so Apple have to slow down the performance a little bit to save the battery life. It's just like when you use a laptop, they have if you are running Windows on a laptop, you have for the battery you have 3 options like energy saving, average, and full throttle. You can choose that. I think this is the same function as in iPhone as in a notebook. Yes.
Dean Crutchfield in New York, is Apple going to lose sales due to this negative publicity? What's the fallout going to be for the company? The loss of faith, coupled, I suppose, with the realization that a customer can replace a battery for, what, $30 and restore performance rather than spend $1,000 on a new one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is not a technology issue. This is not a product problem. This is about Apple's brand and their consumers' love for that brand, their consumers' trust in that brand. So the big question here is this a close shave or a deep cut? And I believe Apple is bleeding. And their response so far adds to the momentum of the chatter that's going out there. I think Bezos often says a brand is what people say about you when they leave the room. And there's a lot of people talking about Apple right now. So this is a much bigger problem than I think they anticipate it could be. I think, therefore, they have to behave in a way that recognizes that crisis can be like a bomb for a brand like Apple, and it can actually, create a lot of problems in terms of people's perception of that brand. So it's not what you say, it's what you do. And here's the interesting thing: if that product strategy was meant to benefit the consumer, how come it wasn't communicated or conveyed in any of the collateral or any of the information that surrounds the product? And there's a lot of information about it. So why have consumers been duped into thinking there's something wrong with their phone?
It's the first major hardware issue, Dean, to hit the iPhone on CEO Tim Cook's watch. How much responsibility for this poor handling of the issue does he have to accept?
You only have one throat to choke, and that's the CEO.
OK. Glyn, can Apple be criticised for timing major upgrades of its operating system to coincide with the release of new phones? Is that ultimately behind this issue?
Well, not really, in the sense that it's the natural time to do it. If you're launching new phones, you tend to launch new software, and therefore people on the older phones want to have some of those benefits, and therefore, you could argue that they're actually doing the users a favour. I mean, I agree that this is really about batteries, and I think it's a very important point here.
I can't see how users it's a favour. I just don't get it.
Well, because you're giving them new features. I mean, when you upgrade the software on a new phone, the people with the old phones
features are slowed down by the fact their phone's being slowed down. So, but they don't get the benefits. No, but that's only because
the batteries are on. As I'm just about to say, the point is you should be able to change your battery more easily. That the issue is how easily you can change your battery. And I think Apple and other manufacturers have been at fault in not making it clear that by changing your battery more regularly, you can actually boost the performance of your phone, and they should make that easier and they should make that cheaper. And so that's the really big issue here, and it affects all manufacturers.
Dean, I mean, Apple has, and so do other.
They've never promoted that initiative.
Yeah, Dean, other manufacturers, just as Apple do, make phones that have no user upgradable parts, unlike the old days when batteries could be removed. I mean, to a certain extent, this is a problem of their own making, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that they've got themselves in this trouble and they need to get themselves out. And the way they're reacting right now is slow. It's very corporate. It's very self-interested. They're taking a 50,000-foot view when they've got to get down to 5 foot where the consumer is and how frustrated that consumer really is thinking about Apple. That's a major problem. They've got to get down to the consumer level and understand how they're feeling.
Dean, what would be the implications for Apple if they lost any of the class action lawsuits currently filed against it on this issue, or even if it was found guilty of planned obsolescence in France, where, as we were hearing earlier, it's illegal?
Yeah, well, I think it would have a very detrimental impact on their brand and a very detrimental impact on their wallet, but their wallet's pretty big. Here, the bigger issue is their brand reputation that is, as we know, worth billions of dollars, and that could be impacted by this debacle. So really, they need to be very mindful of that the success of Apple isn't because of the company, it's because of their consumer that loves the Apple products. And here we're hearing that the actual Apple products have been slowed down without consumers knowing. So I think that makes it rather opaque. And I think to the other guest here, we are looking at Apple to be more transparent. What I want to hear is hide nothing, tell all. What's been going on here and why have you been doing it this way?
Glyn, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I absolutely agree. I'm a great fan of transparency, and I think if this leads to Apple and all manufacturers being more transparent, then that would be a tremendous gain for the consumers because they will see what's going on in the devices which they own. At the moment, Apple and other companies are treated almost as if you don't own the device and you just sort of get it by favour of the companies. So we need more transparency, and we need something. There's a movement called right to repair. You should have a right to repair the things that you buy, and that means putting in new batteries, putting in new screens. At the moment, Apple and other companies make that very hard, and I think that's got to change, and that would avoid a lot of these kind of problems.
Wang Baian, you've been very patient, sir. I know you want to come in on this. Do you want to respond to what you've heard?
Yeah, speaking of transparency, I think since starting from 2008, I was beginning to use MacBook running like Mac OS, there's a built-in indicator inside the MacBook, to indicate the users if their battery is unhealthy or is need to be replaced. I think the iOS is just lack of this function. This is it. It needs the transparency, indicator inside iOS.